Qatar hosts the largest American military base in the entire Middle East. For years, Qatar served as the only functioning communication channel between Washington and Tehran. And this week, Qatar officially confirmed that it is currently not acting as a direct intermediary between Washington and Tehran. This is not a formal withdrawal from diplomacy entirely, but a clear distancing from the active bridge role that Doha has fulfilled for years. The difference between these two descriptions is precisely the point that media coverage has consistently blurred this week. What Qatar has lost this week is not merely a neutral mediator choosing to step back. What has been lost is the entire functional architecture through which a resolution to this conflict could have been constructed. This architecture cannot be replaced according to the timetable that this war dictates. What happens in the next 72 hours builds directly on what Qatar triggered this week. It is essential to understand that Qatar's withdrawal is not a mere diplomatic inconvenience, but a structural rupture. To grasp this, one must consider what Qatar actually represented in this conflict, not symbolically, not historically, but functionally and mechanically. If Tehran wanted to communicate something to Washington without the provocation of direct contact, it went through Doha. If Washington wanted to test Iranian red lines without risking formal diplomatic engagement, it used the Qatari channel. When both sides needed to step back from escalation without publicly admitting de-escalation, Qatar provided the mechanism that made it possible. At the same time, Qatar hosts the largest American military base in the region, Al Udeid, and maintains open diplomatic lines to Iran. This balance takes decades to build and cannot be replaced in weeks. Remove Qatar from this equation, and you don't just lose a mediator. You lose the only functional pathway through which an exit from this war could have been constructed. You lose the early warning system that could signal if one side is crossing a red line before it does. You lose the credibility buffer that allows both parties to explore compromises without appearing weak to their domestic audiences. Nothing currently occupies this role. European powers were already marginalized, lacking the relationships that Qatar has built over 30 years. The United Nations is structurally unable to fill the gap on the timetable this conflict requires. This is no coincidence. It is the direct consequence of what Qatar has experienced. To understand why Qatar drew this line this week, one must look at what came before. Consider what Qatar has absorbed over recent months. Last year, Israel communicated through Qatari channels that it was ready to engage in genuine peace talks. The delegation traveled to Doha on the promise that the invitation was genuine. Israel bombed the meeting. The Hamas delegation in Doha was bombed. Qatar had provided the framework, extended the invitation, and bore the consequences. Qatar continued nonetheless. Then came February 26. An Iranian delegation sat in Geneva in the house of the Omani UN ambassador, with American representatives on the other side of the table. The Omani mediator reported a breakthrough. Iran had agreed not to enrich uranium and to allow full IAEA control. The American negotiator publicly portrayed the talks differently, a contradiction described by diplomats familiar with the discussions as a distortion. The narrative that Friday was that peace in the Middle East was hours from being realized. The next morning, bombs fell. Whatever was agreed upon or not in Geneva, the process at minimum provided diplomatic cover for a military operation already underway before the delegations had even taken their seats. Qatar observed this from within, as the country that enabled communication between both parties. As a country whose entire strategic identity depends on both sides believing the process is genuine, Qatar was used, and Qatar knew it. This is no accident, this is a pattern. And patterns in diplomacy are not just data points, they are maps that show you who you are actually dealing with. What Qatar's official statement actually says deserves careful reading. The media treats it as a suspension of mediation, a pause, which dramatically underestimates what was communicated. Qatar said in terms leaving no room for diplomatic ambiguity. Iran has existed for millennia in this region. The Persian people are not going anywhere. No military campaign, no airstrikes, no combination of political and military pressure will erase a civilization of 90 million people from the map. That is why Qatar does not wish to be involved in a conflict whose stated or implied goal is something history has already deemed impossible. This is not a procedural withdrawal, it is a statement of principle. What Qatar says in carefully measured diplomatic language is that the framework of this war is one in which it cannot legitimately participate. The idea that Iran can be dismantled or existentially transformed from the outside through violence is not a realistic goal. We will not continue to lend our credibility to a process built around an unrealistic objective, especially when the process has already been used twice to kill our people. Now, regarding the development pattern that the media treats as separate stories, though it is one story, in the same week that Qatar distanced itself, the Iraqi Prime Minister accelerated the end of the US-led international coalition. The coalition, which was originally scheduled to conclude in September 2026, is now being ended on an accelerated timeline. The Iraqi Prime Minister cited the escalating regional war that broke out on February 28th. The United States is being asked to leave a country where American forces have been stationed for more than a decade at the invitation of the Iraqi government, on an accelerated schedule, while simultaneously conducting a war in the region. This is directly linked to two strategic pillars, Qatar and Iraq, moving in the same direction during the same week. This is not a coincidence. It reflects the logic of a regional gravitational shift against Washington. Looking at the map of Arab partners Washington still has in this conflict, the picture is clear. According to reporting from the New York Times, the only major Arab state that remains fully aligned with Washington is Saudi Arabia, specifically the Crown Prince. This is the coalition, and this is who remains, which deserves a moment of contextualization. The United States entered this conflict with at least nominal support from a broad Gulf coalition. This week, that coalition consists of a government whose leadership lacks credibility in the Arab world to enhance such support. This is not a peripheral detail, this is the focus of the story. The political geography of the Middle East is shifting against Washington faster than any single military development in the conflict itself. Iraq is accelerating the withdrawal. Qatar is marking its distance. The Arab League is losing its coherence, all within a single week. For Germany and other European economies, the dimension that receives the least attention is simultaneously the most immediate. Qatar is not just a diplomatic actor in this conflict. Qatar is one of the largest suppliers of liquefied natural gas to Europe. Energy companies have already declared force majeure on supply contracts with customers in Italy, Belgium, South Korea, and China. Iranian attacks on the Ras Laffan facility have put 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity out of operation for 3 to 5 years. Shell and Total Energies have passed this declaration on to their customers. This is not an abstract future concern. This is an ongoing supply disruption, which is already affecting European energy prices, even if Germany is not directly on this customer list. Energy markets are integrated. What is lost in Ras Laffan reaches Hamburg. Following the decoupling from Russian gas, the German government deliberately relied on Qatar as a strategic replacement supplier. Contracts with Qatar Energy run until 2044. This strategic move was based on 3 assumptions. Qatar remains stable, Qatar remains neutral, and Qatar stays outside the direct line of fire in this conflict. All 3 assumptions are under significant pressure this week. Added to this is the Strait of Hormuz, which handles more than 20% of globally traded oil. War risk premiums for Gulf transit have multiplied. Some reinsurers have withdrawn coverage for certain contract types. Lloyd's of London clarified that coverage remains generally available, but under conditions that are economically unviable for many operators. Supertanker captains do not plan based on escort guarantees, they calculate probabilities. And probabilities in a conflict without a functional de-escalation channel look fundamentally different. Qatar was not only a mediator between governments, it was also the informal stabilizer preventing individual escalation steps from spiraling out of control. That function no longer exists. The pattern revealed by this conflict extends beyond the conflict itself. The model applied, inviting the other side to negotiations, using the negotiations to gather intelligence and weaken defenses, and then striking, is not a new invention. It has a history in this region, familiar to every government in the Middle East. The Hamas delegation in Doha and the Iranian delegation in Geneva on February 26 both followed the same template, producing the same outcome. Both delegations left the mediating parties to deal with the consequences. What this model destroys is not just a specific diplomatic process, it destroys the credibility of American diplomacy across the entire region. For years, not months, because every government in the Middle East observing this, and they all are now, makes the same calculation. If we participate in a US-led diplomatic process, what guarantee do we have that the process is genuine? What assurance exists that an invitation to negotiations is not itself a targeting mechanism? The answer is none. There is no assurance. And in the absence of assurances, governments act as Qatar has just done. They step back. They protect their people. They refuse to be instruments in a process they can no longer trust. There are two realistic scenarios for the coming weeks. In the first scenario, Qatar's withdrawal is recognized in Washington as a signal. Someone in the administration realizes that destroying the only functional communication channel with Iran is an existential strategic problem. A credible replacement mechanism is constructed. Oman, despite its own caution, is brought into a structured role with explicit security guarantees, clearly distinct from what happened with Qatar. The framework of the conflict does not shift publicly, not in a way that forces anyone to admit failure, but practically, in the substance of what is required at the negotiating table. This path is narrow, its conditions are difficult, and the movements this week, Qatar's distancing, Iraq's accelerated timeline, the silence from Washington, do not make it more likely. In the second scenario, supported more strongly by available data this week, Qatar's withdrawal is treated as a temporary disruption. The war continues along its current trajectory. Iran now has no reliable backchannel to Washington. There is no way to signal de-escalation intentions without those signals being visible to hardliners. Gulf states continue their individual calculations, each withdrawing slightly faster from the coalition than the previous. Saudi Arabia remains Washington's only Arab partner, a relationship with clear limits in terms of regional credibility. Iraq's accelerated withdrawal creates a security vacuum that no one is willing to fill, and the conflict evolves, without the mechanism that helped even end the 12-day war in June 2025, into something larger and less contained. The crucial question now is, which of these two scenarios will confirm itself in the next 72 hours? This question is not answered by official briefings. It is answered by what Oman does next, by the signals coming from Riyadh, by Monday's oil price data, and by the silence from Washington on the only question that truly matters now. Who will replace Qatar? Pakistan has tried to fill the gap. According to mediators, talks in Islamabad have reached a dead end. The question of a replacement is already answered in silence. And here lies the real structural problem. Not that a replacement has not been found, but that a replacement cannot be found on this timeline. Qatar spent 3 decades building the relationships that made it an indispensable bridge. Direct lines to Tehran, credibility in Washington, a constitution anchoring mediation as a state identity. This combination does not exist a second time in the region. Oman has relationships, but no base that simultaneously marks it as an American partner. Turkey has reach, but no neutral reputation with Iran. No one in the region possesses the specific profile that Qatar has built over decades. This is not pessimism, it is geography and history informing a calculation. What does this mean concretely? Iran currently has no reliable way to convey de-escalation intentions to Washington without those signals becoming public. And public signals are not diplomatic signals. They are domestic political communication that hardliners on both sides exploit for their own purposes. The absence of a discrete channel is not neutral. It creates structural pressure toward escalation, not because anyone wants to escalate, but because the mechanism that would allow de-escalation without loss of face is missing. Markets have already understood this, even if reporting has not fully priced it in. War risk premiums in the Gulf are rising not just because of the attacks, they are rising because the market no longer sees a functional de-escalation signal. People calibrate not by headlines, but by the probability that an escalation can be stopped before it becomes another. That probability has shifted this week, not dramatically, but measurably. And measurable is enough to alter insurance mathematics, enough to change tanker rates, enough to change energy prices, enough to reach German household bills. The answer is already reflected in market data, in the nature of the silence from Washington, in the movements of regional governments still caught in the middle, watching what has happened to the country. That was intended to be useful for all. What FromReport.de does in this context is not taking sides. It is not adopting a narrative. It is the work that arises from reading primary sources before anyone else has decided how to interpret them. When you connect what a Qatari exceptional envoy says with what is read a week later at a German fuel station, FromReport.de fills in the gap. Major media report what is confirmed, what is officially communicated, what fits in a 2-minute news segment. FromReport.de reports what lies between these reports. If Oman formalizes its own calculations, the analysis will be here. If the oil markets fully price in the absence of a de-escalation channel, the analysis will be here. If Washington announces a replacement mechanism or decides not to, the analysis will be here. Facts first, analysis after. What that means for you, always. This is From Report.